Thanks so much, Noel. So just for those of you who've just joined, I've just put the purpose of the session into the chat so you can get it there full of emojis. So as Noel said, the purpose of this session is about peer learning and peer learning practices. Share some of my thinking and some stuff that I've collected along the way about that subject. But before I get into that, oh, thanks, Noel. I've just made you co-host, so you should be able to let people in. Before I get onto that, let me just explain who I am.
Like to get some yummy cake and coffee from like another place or rich.
That's wonderful. Do you know what? All I want is yummy cake and coffee. So I'm just gonna put that on mute. Hey, Nick. Hi. So let me explain a little bit about. That was a great intro about me and basis. So Noel, can you see the screen okay? Am I sharing the right one?
Yeah, can see that one.
Thanks so much. So basis exists to help public services solve messy problems, societal problems, and we do that with agile interventions that aim to improve services quite quickly. So that's what we do. A little bit about me. That's me. You can tell it's me because there's a moustache on the face. I started out work in the Job Centre Plus, working on the front line there. And I then joined the National Graduate Development Programme for local government in 2010. So I worked in local government for almost 10 years. And at one time or another, I've worked in pretty much all services in local government. And I joined Basis about 4 years ago. And I lead the company. And I know a bit about a few things. I know a bit about agile and service design and self-organizing teams, a bit about facilitation. None of those ideas or none of the ideas that I have in those areas are original, but hopefully the way that I package them up is kind of useful. And one of the things that I've got really, really passionate about over the last few years is peer learning. And it turns out that there are a whole bunch of organizations that are developing emerging practices that I think are really useful to explore, particularly in the context of local government, because these practices are emerging in organizations that are also trying to solve really complex problems. So let's get on with what we're going to cover today. So here's the agenda. A bit about me. Check. 3 peer learning practices. We'll talk about those and some use cases for local government. A story about crustaceans, which I promise will be relevant. And I drew that crab myself. I am taking commissions. We'll talk about a facilitation structure that you can use to explore peer learning and emerging good practices in your organizations might be useful for this community. And I'll also create a little bit of time to practice as well. So let's start with these peer learning practices. So the first one is the week note. And this is something that I'm sure that some of you are already doing. So the week note, or to week note as a verb, is to work in the open, to share one's work processes, thoughts, reflections to a group as a means of aiding collaborative working. Now, week notes can take the form of just a tweet at the end of the week. They could be something a bit more comprehensive, like a piece of writing or a blog, or if you're feeling ambitious, it could even be a video capturing your experiences over the course of the week. I do these religiously in Basis, and I find them really, really useful for a whole bunch of reasons. Firstly, it's a good way of encouraging communication and dialogue with a community of people that are trying to solve similar problems. And if you make a contribution to a community, you'll find that you get contributions back. Noel is amazing at doing this. You kind of share your thinking really, really regularly. And I'm sure from I'd love to hear your experience on this. I'm sure you get kind of contributions back by virtue of putting into that community. So it's really great for that. It's a good way of just reflecting on your own learning at the end of the week and identifying your own progress. Nothing more motivating than one's own progress. And sometimes we just forget, don't we, that we've made some progress in the week, and a week note helps us to reflect on that. But also I've found that it's a really good way of helping other people who are solving common problems cut a path through a bit of mess very, very easily. Sometimes I share something and I think, well, maybe this isn't that useful. Maybe this is a trivial reflection, but somebody will reach out and say, hey, that was actually really useful. You've managed to clarify some things for me, and it didn't, and it very rarely takes me a huge amount of effort to do that. So the week note, very, very simple. There are lots of ways of week noting. There's some inspiration here on this Medium thread, and I'll share these slides with you afterwards. Lots of people in government sharing their thoughts about the progress that they're making on a weekly basis. And if you want to see a completely different example of a week note, Then you can check out this one that I did recently, which is tracking our progress in organising GovCamp Cymru, which is GovCamp for Wales. I'm part of a team that's organising that. And I like to week note with a little Loom video at the end of the week. So I kind of talk to a Trello board, or I'm just going to, there we go, thanks, Noel. So I just talk about our progress over the course of the week, move some things around on a Trello board, and you can see me in a little Loom at the bottom of the screen. It only takes me about 5 minutes to do, and I get some really useful feedback as a consequence of sharing that. So that's practice number 1, the week note. A little bit more complex, talk about the blueprint. So before I get into that, let me explain the organization from whom I discovered this practice. So this is the Dutch word that I was mentioning I was going to say. So this is an organization called Buurtzorg, which is Dutch, literally means neighborhood care. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this organization. And the only reason that I can pronounce those phonemes is because Welsh is my first language. I'm not sure, I apologize for those of you who had to wince at the sound of that. But Buurtzorg is a community care organization that was established back in 2017 with one team of 4 nurses. And it's a completely different model of care whereby small teams of up to about 9 people take full responsibility for a neighborhood. They self-organize, there are no managers at all. There's a tiny back office of about 50 staff to 14,000 frontline workers. And teams within neighborhoods have discretion over the budget they spend. They get to figure out how best to meet the needs of the community that they exist to serve. It's an amazing organization. If you're interested in finding out about their model, there's loads of stuff written about them. They're reliably voted as the top employer in the Netherlands, and they get really great outcomes by comparison with traditional care providing organizations. Now, one of the challenges that Buurtzorg faces is that you've got 850 self-organizing teams, and they're all discovering innovative practices within their localities. How do you share those innovative practices across the organization without a means or structure to do that? If you were to impose a top-down process of doing that, that would kind of undermine the whole principles of the organization. So the way they figured out of doing this is via the blueprint. So this is how it works. There was a team a few years ago that identified a potential solution to resolving the issue of people falling and going into hospital and essentially seeing their kind of circumstances drastically what am I trying to say? They identified that people were falling in the home and they wanted to try and reduce that. So what they decided to do was to add a physio to the team to see if they could do some reablement work or some accident prevention work with their service users. And this had a massive impact really, really quickly. They shared this story with the chief exec of the organization, who's a guy called Jos de Blok. And he said, well, this is really cool. I'm sure other people would benefit from this. Why don't you write a story about it? Talk to some service users, find out what their experience of this change was, share their voice, maybe write a little blueprint, some guidelines of how other people might like to test this out in their areas, maybe some learning, some of the things that worked, some of the things that didn't work, some steps that people might need to go through if they wanted to set up a similar team in their area. They did exactly that. And over time, every single team within Buurtzorg has become a Buurtzorg Plus team. They now have a physiotherapist within the organization. So instead of trying to force this on all teams from the top down, they just released a blueprint and allowed that innovation to spread organically. So that's the blueprint. I think this has really wide application or potential for wide application in lots of different organizations and in services in local government. At the moment, I'm working with the London Borough of Newham to help the corporate director for Brighter Futures set up a new role, which is the local children's commissioner. And as part of that work, she's established a forum that connects young people with senior leaders across the system in a really innovative way that encourages great participation. And I think that forum has some potential to be used elsewhere. So rather than writing up a really lengthy case study, we're producing a blueprint. These are the steps we went through. These are the pitfalls that we identified. Here are some of the steps that you might need to go through if you wanted to test out a similar approach in your area, and just put it out into the world. and see if it works. I'm sure you can think of examples of where blueprints might be appropriate in different service areas. That's number 2, the blueprint. Number 3, communities of practice and interest. So this is very relevant because we are in a community of practice or a community of interest, but there are some organizations that are doing this in such a way that allows information to spread very rapidly and very organically. And one such organization is Spotify. So at just as they were founded, they realized that in order to make quick progress on the development side of things, they needed self-organizing teams with their own area of responsibility. So somebody might have responsibility for user experience, somebody for search, somebody else for playlists. But that could create a situation where knowledge and learning didn't spread across the organization. So what they decided to do was to set up chapters and guilds, and chapters brought together people with the same functional specialism. So you might have a chapter of back-end developers or a chapter of user experience designers come together and share good practice and emerging learning in their field in order to make sure that everybody in the organization could benefit from that. Similarly, guilds brought together people from different functional specialisms who had the same interests. So you might have a group of people within the organization who were interested in self-management or agile working practices, or maybe mindfulness in the workplace. And they could come together regardless of the fact that they worked in different areas of functional specialism. And to make this happen, you need somebody who's got a bit of grit and an interest in making it happen, and convenes people, shares information, a bit like Noel does for this community. But Spotify have said that this approach was one of the things that was so integral to their rapid expansion. And I can imagine that this kind of thing could be applied in all kinds of different service areas. So at the moment, I'm working in North Wales, in rural North Wales, trying to establish models that are quite similar to the Buurtzorg model, whereby you bring together professionals from different agencies and different backgrounds to help vulnerable elderly people live longer in the community or live their lives in the way that they want to live them. So you've got social workers and nurses, mental health practitioners, GPs, all working in neighborhood teams. Now I can imagine that you could have a chapter of OTs or of physios sharing learning about what they're finding in their unique area. Likewise, you could have a guild of people interested in technology and how you can use that to share information across different organizational boundaries, a challenge that is consistent across all local authorities. So I think this approach, although it originated in the software development world, could equally be applied to services in local government. Now, I have talked for a little while already. So what I would love to do is to give you the opportunity to speak in smaller groups about some practices that you've identified that have helped people to share learning or share peer learning in a way that's successful and systematic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up some breakout rooms in just a second. And I'd like you to, there we go, stop sharing my screen. I'd like you to consider this question. So the question is, it's in the chat. What are some of the ways in which you've seen peer learning done successfully and systematically in your context? This could be experience from a previous life or a previous organization, but I'd love us to use this as an opportunity to get some more of that learning into the room. I'm going to open up some breakout areas so that we can have that conversation. There we go. You'll notice this is the breakout face. Intense concentration. That's the secret. So we're going to talk about positive deviance. This phrase needs a little bit of unpacking because it could be easily misunderstood, and I will do the unpacking in just a moment. But first, let me talk to you about these two. So the traditional approach to solving problems, or complex problems anyway, is you kind of try and figure out what's going on. You do some user research, you look at the data, you understand what some of the barriers are, and then you come up with some solutions, test the solutions, figure out what works, iterate on the solutions that do, and get rid of the solutions that don't, and scale the ones that do work. And that is perfectly logical. That is 95% of the work that I do at Basis. But sometimes that approach ignores the fact that some people within a group may have come up with great solutions already to the problem. It sort of misses the opportunity to amplify those great solutions and to scale them. And this is where positive deviance comes in. A little bit of background. These two, it's not particularly accurate drawing, I must admit, another one of my creations. These two are Jerry and Monique Sternin. In the 1990s, they worked for Save the Children, and they were asked by the Vietnamese government to see if they couldn't help tackle the problem of malnourishment or malnutrition in children living in rural communities. And at the time, about 50% of Vietnamese children were malnourished. They expected that they would have a few years to solve this problem, but when they arrived, they didn't get a particularly welcome response from the Vietnamese government, and they said, look, you've got 6 months to make a difference here, and then you've got to go. This is where the crustaceans come in. So the conventional wisdom about how to go about solving malnourishment is that it's all about kind of poor sanitation and food distribution patterns, poverty, tackling that, lack of access to good water, like all that's true, but those solutions were not really available to the Sternins because they didn't have time to be able to make any difference really on those really complex problems. So they reached for an unconventional solution, which is amplifying positive deviance. Now, positive deviance, this is what it means. So in every community or organization, social group, there will be individuals who, because of their exceptional behaviors or practices, they are able to get better results than their neighbors or other people without any additional resources. So without realizing it, these positive deviants, they've discovered a path to success for the whole group. And if their secrets can be kind of analyzed and isolated and shared with other people, then it might make a difference for them too. And it turned out in Vietnam, there were a whole bunch of positive deviants within every rural community. So in some communities or in some villages, there were families whose children weren't malnourished. Their families didn't have better jobs, didn't have more money, but the children's weren't malnourished. They observed these families and discovered that the mothers were going out into the rice paddies early in the morning and foraging for greens and crustaceans, so little shrimps and little crabs. And they would bring them home, boil them, and add them to the children's food. Now, the conventional wisdom or the kind of cultural norms dictated that you didn't do this because people assumed that feeding that kind of food to children would make them ill. Anyway, they decided to try and explore the possibility of amplifying these positive deviants. So they brought together the mothers that were feeding their children these crustaceans. They asked them if they would be willing to recruit other families and show them how to forage for these animals and for the greens, teach them how to cook them and prepare them. And over the course of 2 weeks, a small group of mothers realized that actually their children weren't getting sick from eating this food and they were visibly more healthy. And then those mothers recruited some more people and some more and some more and some more. And by the end of the project, 80% of families or children within families that were working with the project were no longer malnourished. So this is a really simple example of amplifying positive deviance. Now, how do you go about uncovering it? Well, it turns out there is a really useful liberating structure that helps to identify positive deviance. Now, liberating structures, if you're not familiar with them, are facilitation structures or patterns that involve everybody in coming up with solutions or involve everybody in shaping the future. They're structures that you can follow to ensure that you distribute turn-taking, that you democratize the idea generation process. And there is one that has been designed specifically to help identify positive deviance. So here's what I'd like us to do. I'll explain the topic of conversation in just a second. But in groups of 4 to 5, so I'll mix up the breakout groups, I'd like you to very quickly choose a facilitator And that facilitator doesn't have a difficult job. They're just going to run through some questions. That's all. Choose a facilitator and choose a recorder. The facilitator will ask 7 questions, one after another, and the whole group will have the opportunity to respond. The facilitator will capture some insights and the recorder jots them down on a piece of paper. You can just do this on your computer. We're not going to do any kind of fancy Jamboard or digital whiteboard stuff. Just old-fashioned, just jot them down. So you'll have 20 minutes to capture some insights. And then at the end, we'll debrief and share with the group. I'm just going to post the sequence of steps in the chat, just so that everybody can see them. Choose a facilitator and recorder. Facilitator asks 7 questions, one after another, and then the whole group can respond while the insights are captured. So what we're going to look at is an issue that is relevant to lots of people on this call, which is the cost of living crisis, particularly people who are working in policy at the moment. I know that this is really top of your agenda. So the 7 questions, which I'll paste into the chat in just a second, are these. How do you know when a problem with the cost of living is present? How do you contribute effectively to solving the cost of living crisis? What prevents you from doing this or taking these actions all the time? Do you know anybody who's able to frequently solve this problem and overcome barriers? And what behaviors or practices made this success possible? Do you have any ideas? What needs to be done to make those ideas happen? And who else needs to be involved? I'd really like you to go through each of these questions because they're designed with a specific purpose in mind. Thinking back to what we were talking about earlier on about psychological safety and conversational turn taking, I'd love it if the facilitator could try and encourage people to go one by one. We go around the room. You don't have to talk. You can just say, I want to pass, but at least try and make sure that everybody gets to distribute the talk time and have their voice heard in the room. I'm going to put the questions into the chat and they should follow you. So you'll take those with you. I'm going to let's have a look what the time is. So it's 1:45. So I'll give us about 12 minutes to do that. So I haven't got quite as long as I was hoping for. If you can't get through all the questions, that's absolutely fine. At least make a start. And I'd love you to get to the question about, does anybody else have any ideas that they've observed in their own context that might be relevant to your own? So the questions are in the chat. I'm going to mix up the breakout rooms just so that you get to talk with some new folks. And I'll put on my breakout room face again. Recreate. Cool. And I'll see you back here in about 12 minutes. Any questions before I send you off? You can just shout. No? Okay. See you soon.